The forest smelled of rain and pine when Dalton Keene guided his wagon up the narrow mountain trail. It had taken him 3 days to reach this place, 3 days of silence, dust, and thoughts he didn't want. The cabin waiting ahead was supposed to be the start of something new. A small square of land where he could rebuild what life had taken. He had lost his ranch, his brother, and every coin he owned to creditors. This cabin was all he had left. When he finally saw the roofline through the trees, a flicker of hope stirred in his chest. But the feeling didn't last. A thin ribbon of smoke curled from the chimney. Someone was inside. Dalton slowed the horses and listened. The woods were still, except for the creak of the wagon wheels and the faint crackle of burning wood. He felt the familiar weight of his revolver against his hip and drew a steady breath. The seller in town had sworn the cabin was empty. Either the man had lied, or someone had moved in since the deed changed hands. Climbing down, Dalton felt the chill bite through his coat. The ground was damp, the air heavy with mist. He tied the reins to the porch rail and studied the door. The wood was weathered but solid, the kind built by someone who meant to stay a while. He pushed it open without knocking. Warm air and the smell of bread washed over him. The cabin was tidy for an abandoned place. Fresh flowers stood in a jar on the table. A blanket lay neatly folded on a chair. Dalton's hand hovered near his gun as he stepped inside. Then he froze. A woman stood by the fireplace, her back to him, auburn hair glinting in the firelight. She turned at the sound of the door, and for a moment they simply stared at each other. Her eyes were green, startling, sharp, and cautious. Dalton felt his pulse quicken, not from attraction, but from the sudden awareness that this stranger was not afraid. She looked ready to defend what she considered hers. "You must be the new owner," she said, her voice calm but guarded. Dalton took off his hat. "Yes, ma'am. Name's Dalton Keene. Bought this place, fair and legal." She nodded slowly, as if she had been expecting those words. "I'm Cora Lane," she said, "and before you tell me to leave, you should know I can't." The answer caught him off guard. Can't or won't? Her eyes softened for just a second, then hardened again. Both. Dalton studied her. She wasn't dressed like a vagrant. Her clothes were clean, her posture straight, her expression proud. Nothing about her fit the picture of a thief or drifter. Still, it was his cabin. "Miss Lane, I don't know what understanding you had with the last owner," he said evenly, "but I hold the deed now. That makes this place mine." Cora looked back at the fire. The flames flickered across her face, catching the edge of something he couldn't name. Fear, maybe, or memory. "There are things about this cabin you don't understand, Mr. Keene. Things that won't change just because you have papers in your pocket." Dalton frowned. "I only care that I paid for it." Before she could answer, the faint rhythm of hoofbeats echoed through the trees outside. Fast, more than one horse. Cora's color drained. She crossed the room in 2 quick steps and pulled the curtain aside, peering through the glass. "How many people know you came here today?" she whispered. "None," Dalton said. "Why?" Her voice trembled. "Because whoever's out there, they're not here by chance." Dalton moved beside her, saw 3 riders winding up the trail, their coats dark against the pale morning. The lead man rode like he owned the ground beneath him. Cora's hands shook as she let the curtain fall. "He's found me," she breathed. Dalton didn't know who he was, but he knew trouble when he saw it. His fresh start had just become a fight he hadn't planned for. Dalton had faced rustlers, droughts, and debt collectors, but nothing unnerved him quite like the woman standing beside his fireplace. Coraline didn't flinch when the hoofbeats grew louder outside. She didn't even look at him. She just whispered, "They've found me," like she'd been waiting for that moment all along. Dalton stepped closer to the window. Through the curtain, 3 riders appeared on the trail, moving with purpose. Not travelers, hunters. He turned to her. "You know them?" Her eyes glimmered in the firelight. "I was hoping I never would again." That was enough for him to understand this wasn't a simple misunderstanding. Whoever those men were, they meant her harm. "You'd better tell me what's going on," he said quietly. Cora took a slow breath, steadying herself. "His name is Marcus Webb. He's the man I was married to or forced to marry." Her voice cracked slightly, but she didn't look away. "He's a man who believes people can be owned, and I was part of his property." Dalton felt his stomach tighten. He'd met men like that before, self-appointed kings with money, guns, and no conscience. "If that's true," he said, "you picked the wrong place to hide. I just bought this cabin. It's mine now." Her expression softened, almost apologetic. "Then I'm sorry. Because if he finds me here, he'll destroy everything you own." Marcus Webb doesn't accept no for an answer. Outside, the sound of hooves stopped. The horses snorted and stamped in the dirt. Dalton could hear voices, low, confident, cruel. He looked toward the door, then back at Cora. "How long have you been here?" 3 weeks, she said. "Long enough to know the forest, not long enough to feel safe." "Why here?" She hesitated, then said, "Because this was the last place Marcus would look. The man who sold it told me nobody wanted to live this far from town. I thought I could start over. But I didn't know he'd sell it again." Dalton rubbed the back of his neck, trying to think. He hadn't come here looking for trouble. He just wanted peace, a place to heal from losing his brother and his ranch. Now, trouble was standing on his porch, and a terrified woman was asking him to stand between her and a man who clearly had no mercy. He walked to the table, unbuckling the strap of his revolver. "If they come through that door," he said, "stay behind me." Cora's voice was barely a whisper. "You don't have to do this." "Maybe not," Dalton replied, "but it doesn't sit right letting a woman face something like that alone." The first knock came like a gunshot, heavy, deliberate, echoing through the cabin. "Open up," a man's voice barked. "We know you're in there, Cora." Cora froze, every trace of color gone from her face. Dalton drew his revolver. "You stay out of sight," he said. "Let me handle it." He opened the door just enough to step outside. 3 men stood in the clearing. The one in front was tall, with a black beard and a polished gun belt. His cold eyes moved over Dalton like a hawk sizing up a rabbit. "Name's Marcus Webb," he said, his voice oily with authority. "I'm looking for my wife." Dalton didn't blink. "You're trespassing. This is my cabin." Marcus smiled thinly. "I paid for the woman inside with more money than you've ever seen. She belongs to me." "Something inside," Dalton snapped. "Nobody belongs to anybody," he said, his voice low but steady. The man beside Marcus shifted his weight, ready to draw. The third man's hand rested on his rifle. Tension hung in the cold air, sharp as glass. Marcus's smile faded. You don't want to die for someone else's mistake, cowboy. Step aside, and you can keep your pretty little cabin." Dalton didn't move. The decision was already made. He'd lost everything once. He wasn't about to lose his soul by turning away. Behind him, he heard Cora's voice, soft but full of courage. "You'll have to kill us both." Marcus's eyes darkened. "So be it." The forest went silent, waiting for the storm that was about to break. The morning mist clung to the pines as Dalton Keene kept a careful watch on the three riders outside his cabin. Every muscle in his body tensed, ready for the moment when the calm would shatter. Cora stood silently behind him, her hands gripping the edge of the table, eyes wide with fear and determination. Dalton's mind raced. He didn't know much about Marcus Webb, except the name and the cold authority he carried like armor. But one thing was clear. Marcus wasn't coming for a friendly visit. These men had the air of predators, measured, disciplined, and dangerous. Dalton slid his revolver into his grip and moved closer to the door, peering through the small window. The lead rider was tall, dark-bearded, and radiated the kind of menace that only comes from absolute confidence. The other two flanked him like trained soldiers, silent and watchful. Dalton's pulse hammered in his chest. He glanced back at Cora. "Stay calm," he said softly. "Whatever happens, stay behind me." She nodded, but her fingers shook on the table. He could feel the tension, a silent plea for protection that twisted something deep inside him. Dalton knew he was risking everything: his cabin, his new beginning, his life, but he also knew letting her face this alone was not an option. As he opened the door a fraction, the cold morning wind rushed in, carrying the scent of horses and leather. Marcus Webb's eyes locked on him immediately, a thin, dangerous smile curling across his face. "There you are," the man said, voice calm but deadly. "I've been looking forward to this." Dalton stepped fully onto the porch, gun at the ready. "This is private property," he said firmly. "You don't belong here." Marcus's smile widened, a flicker of cruel amusement in his dark eyes. "That woman behind you is my wife," he said, emphasizing the word as if ownership made it law. "And she's coming with me." Dalton's jaw clenched. "She's not your wife. She never wanted to be." Marcus's laugh was low, chilling. "The law doesn't care about her wishes, cowboy. Ownership is all that matters out here." Dalton's hand tightened around the revolver's handle. His eyes swept the clearing, taking in the three men, their weapons, their confidence. They were experienced, dangerous, yet he felt something else burning, righteous anger that made him stand taller. "Miss Lane is my guest," Dalton said, voice steady. "That makes this my concern." The air grew heavier, every sound amplified: the creak of a saddle, the shifting of boots on dry earth. The two men flanking Marcus moved slightly, anticipating conflict, but Marcus raised a hand, commanding them to hold. "You're outnumbered," Marcus said. "Walk away, and no one gets hurt." Dalton's eyes didn't leave the man. "This isn't just your fight," he said. "It's about what's right." Cora's breath hitched behind him. "Don't lose everything because of me," she whispered. Dalton felt her fear, but also the quiet courage she'd shown since the moment he stepped through the cabin door. He nodded, a silent promise forming between them. She wouldn't face this alone. Marcus's grin faltered, just slightly, as if he hadn't expected such defiance. "Very well," he said. Then let's see who's truly in control. The sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the clearing. The forest waited, the cabin waited, and Dalton Keene, standing between a woman and a dangerous man, knew the first shot would decide more than just property, would decide survival. The air grew taut, each second stretching like the bow of a drawn horse. Dalton Keene stood square on the porch, revolver poised, muscles coiled, every instinct screaming alert. Marcus Webb didn't rush. He moved with the confidence of a man who had faced fear and crushed it before breakfast. His black beard caught the morning light, his eyes cold and calculating. The two men flanking him mirrored his patience, hands hovering near holstered weapons. Dalton's gaze flicked to Cora, inside, her hands pressed against the table, knuckles white. He gave her a subtle nod. Stay behind me. Dalton knew he had little room to negotiate. These men weren't bluffing. Marcus Webb was the kind of man who believed in ownership of land, livestock, women. Dalton's cabin, though legally his, was just a line on the map to this man. Marcus took a step forward. "I've been searching for my wife," he said, voice smooth, almost casual, but the edge in it cut sharper than any knife. "And I intend to take her home." Dalton's jaw tightened. "She doesn't belong to you. Not now, not ever." Marcus laughed, low and sinister. "Ownership is what counts, cowboy. You have papers, but I have the law. And my patience." Dalton's hand shifted slightly on his revolver. The cold morning air smelled of pine and leather, of dust and danger. Every nerve in Dalton's body tightened like a drawn bowstring. Marcus's men adjusted their stance, ready to act at a flick of his wrist. Dalton realized the first shot could erupt the entire clearing into chaos. He took a deep breath, keeping his voice calm but firm. "Miss Lane is my guest," he said, locking eyes with Marcus. "That makes this my fight." A flicker passed over Marcus's face, something uncalculated, a hint of surprise, maybe respect, maybe irritation. "Your guest," he repeated, letting the words sink in. "How long have you known her?" Dalton kept his gaze unwavering. "Long enough to know she won't be going anywhere she doesn't choose." The lead man's hand twitched near his gun, but Marcus held him back with a subtle motion. He turned his attention fully to Dalton, assessing him as a man weighs a stubborn stallion, dangerous, strong-willed, unpredictable. "Very well," Marcus said finally, voice low and deliberate. "If it's a fight you want, cowboy, then we'll see what kind of man you really are." Dalton felt the surge of anger, tempered by focus. His mind replayed every loss, every betrayal. The empty feeling when his brother Samuel's life was taken and his ranch lost. Marcus hadn't just come for a woman. He had come to assert ownership, to dominate, to destroy what Dalton and Cora represented. Cora's whisper reached him behind his back. "Be careful. He won't stop for anything." Dalton's grip tightened. He didn't intend to stop either. He adjusted his stance, eyes tracking Marcus and the men, anticipating their first move. Marcus's face darkened, the casual confidence replaced by the deadly seriousness of a man who expects control. "You may have courage," Marcus said, voice low, "but it will cost you. Choose wisely." Dalton squared his shoulders, feeling the weight of his revolver against his hip. He had nothing left to lose but his integrity and the life of the woman behind him. For the first time since losing everything, Dalton felt a cold clarity, justice, protection, and survival were on the same line. The forest held its breath. The cabin seemed to shrink in the tension, the shadows long, the wind still. In that frozen moment, Dalton realized the battle wouldn't just be about property or revenge, would be about who could control destiny and who would survive. And for the first time since stepping into the clearing, he was ready. The wind carried the scent of pine and gunpowder as Dalton Keene's finger hovered over the trigger. Every muscle in his body screamed readiness, every sense heightened to a razor's edge. Marcus Webb didn't flinch, his black-bearded face calm, almost smug, but his eyes glimmered with lethal intent. The two men flanking him were taut, hands twitching over holsters, waiting for the signal. Dalton's heart hammered. But beneath the fear burned a controlled rage. This wasn't just about the cabin, or Cora, or even himself. It was about justice, revenge for Samuel, and protecting a life that didn't deserve to be claimed by a monster. Cora's voice broke through, soft but urgent. "Dalton, be careful." He nodded slightly, though he didn't break his aim. She stepped back, clutching the table edge, knuckles white. Dalton's eyes flicked between Marcus and the two men. The first man moved to fast. Dalton anticipated, fired. A sharp crack echoed. The man went down, clutching his shoulder, spinning off balance. The second man lunged, gun drawn. Dalton ducked, rolled, and fired in a single fluid motion. A thundering heartbeat later, he heard the second man stumble and fall. Marcus's grin faltered, replaced with fury. "Cowboy," he barked, drawing his revolver in one smooth motion. Dalton's gun barked back. Smoke curled from the barrels, mingling with the rising morning mist. They circled each other in the small clearing, eyes locked, every movement measured, every breath deliberate. Dalton's mind raced. One wrong move, one hesitation, and the blood would be his and Cora's to bear. Marcus's grin returned, cruel and sharp. "You think courage saves you," he shouted. Dalton didn't answer. He didn't have to. Every movement was an unspoken reply, precision, experience, and raw determination. The first exchange of fire was quick, brutal, and decisive. Dalton's focus, sharpened by grief and righteous anger, gave him the edge. He wasn't just fighting for property or pride. He was fighting for life itself. A sudden shift to the left, a flash of movement. Marcus's gun arm went slack. Dalton's shot had found its mark. Marcus staggered, surprise and disbelief flickering across his face. The forest seemed to exhale, the tension breaking as Marcus's two men scrambled to retreat, some in pain, some in fear. Dalton kept his revolver trained, heart hammering, sweat dripping down his brow. He heard Cora behind him, quiet and steady. "It's over." Dalton lowered his gun only slightly, walking forward, eyes never leaving Marcus. The man's chest rose and fell, erratically, the smugness gone, replaced by raw realization. Dalton's jaw tightened. "It ends now," he said, voice low and controlled, the weight of Samuel's memory behind every word. Marcus's lips twisted in a grimace, but he couldn't speak. Dalton knew the fight was won, but the cost and tension of survival clung to him like a shadow. Cora stepped forward, cautiously, still clutching the rifle. Her hands were steady now, but her eyes glimmered with relief and exhaustion. Dalton felt something shift inside him, a strange mix of adrenaline, grief, and victory. He looked at the cabin, his cabin, and realized It was no longer just a shelter. It had become a fortress, a place where courage and justice had collided and survived. The surviving men fled into the forest, leaving only silence and the distant echo of hoofbeats fading away. Dalton knelt beside Marcus, checking for life, but the fight was over. The threat had been neutralized. Cora's hand touched his arm, lightly, grounding him, reminding him of why he had drawn his weapon at all. In that moment, Dalton understood something vital. Some battles aren't about revenge, they're about protection. About standing for what's right when no one else will. He stood, letting the weight of the victory settle. The morning sun had climbed higher, lighting the clearing, illuminating the cabin and the two of them. Dalton exhaled, the tension leaving him in slow waves. Cora's eyes met his, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he saw something unspoken but understood: trust, relief, and the beginning of hope. The cabin was safe, justice had been served, and life, messy, dangerous, beautiful life, would continue. The forest was quiet now, the aftermath of gunfire replaced by the soft rustle of pine needles in the morning breeze. Dalton Keene stood on the porch of his cabin, the weight of the previous hours heavy on his shoulders, yet tempered by a hard-earned relief. Marcus Webb lay defeated, his men gone or fleeing, and the threat that had loomed over Cora was finally gone. She stepped outside, her auburn hair catching the sun's first real light, and Dalton felt the tight knot of tension inside him loosen. Her hands rested on her growing belly, and he noticed how careful and deliberate her movements were, each one a quiet testament to the life she carried. Dalton looked at the cabin he had bought with all his savings, the place he thought would be a solitary refuge, and realized it had transformed into something far greater: sanctuary. Cora approached him slowly, her eyes bright but tinged with exhaustion. "It's over," she said softly. "Everything's over." Dalton nodded, though he knew the scars of the past would not disappear so easily. He reached for her hand, letting the connection speak the words neither dared to say aloud. They didn't need to speak of fear or loss. The morning carried those lessons in its quiet light. Dalton stepped down onto the soft earth, scanning the horizon. The pine forest stretched endlessly, but the clearing around the cabin felt like a small, sacred space. "You'll be safe here," he said. "I won't let anyone hurt you." The child. Cora's green eyes met his, shimmering with gratitude and something more: a quiet trust that had grown in the midst of chaos. "I never expected anyone to stand for me," she admitted, her voice catching. Dalton shook his head, almost incredulous. "Nobody deserves to be alone when the world tries to crush them." They walked to the edge of the porch together, sunlight spilling over the wooden planks, illuminating the cabin and the small garden Cora had begun to cultivate. Dalton picked up a weathered map that Samuel had left behind, tucked carefully in the back of the drawer. Evidence of Marcus Webb's crimes had been recovered from the mountains, as Samuel intended, clearing Cora's name, validating her escape, and bringing justice for the murdered ranchers. Dalton smiled faintly, thinking of his brother, finally vindicated through courage and persistence. Cora's hands rested lightly on her belly again. "Do you think he would have approved?" she asked, nodding toward Dalton. Dalton looked down at the ground, remembering Samuel's lessons, his laughter, and the sense of fair justice he had always believed in. "He would," Dalton said firmly. "He would have known the right person was standing for you." Cora smiled, a soft, genuine curve of her lips that spoke of relief, hope, and trust. The cabin, once a simple investment of money, had become a symbol of survival, love, and a future worth fighting for. Months passed, the cabin rebuilt, fields tilled, and the small home bustling with life once more. Dalton watched Cora hanging laundry in the warm morning sun, her belly round with the child they would soon welcome. The baby kicked for the first time one morning, and Dalton felt a rare, unburdened joy fill his chest. He remembered Samuel and the sacrifices that had brought them here, and he knew the legacy of courage and protection would continue. Cora turned to him, hand on her stomach, and asked softly, "Have you decided on a name?" Dalton knelt beside her, taking her hand gently. "Samuel," he said, after a pause, "for the man who made all this possible." Cora nodded, smiling through tears of happiness. The forest was quiet, the cabin safe, and the future fragile, uncertain, yet bright awaited them. Dalton Keene had arrived seeking solitude and healing, but he had found far more: justice for his brother, a life saved, and the promise of new beginnings. In the golden light of dawn, with the smell of pine and bread drifting from the cabin, he finally understood that some purchases and some battles were worth more than gold.